Being here, I'm really happy to see you. For me, even if this is the fourth year of education here, is the first time in which I see the class in the first day, because usually this time of the year I'm stuck on the other side of the ocean, and so I'm really pleased to see you all here, not knowing each other yet, and starting a new journey, a new part of your adventure, a new piece of your life that is going to unfold in the next couple of years. So, of course, Saki brought the flag so high that now here I cannot help to kind of fall down in the banality of flesh and blood life. So, what I would like to talk about today is a little bit. I mean, it's not going to be long, but certainly what we have experienced in this last 30 years or so has been a major reversal of the relationship of power between the public and the private. I kind of tend to locate things earlier in history. I don't believe so much in 2011 as a turning point of existence, even if in the American narrative it is kind of the umbilicus of the world and the birth. But I kind of think that the evil of capitalism as a structure of power, as a structure of exploitation, were apparent way earlier than that. And however, despite the fact that many people had it clear that capitalism would not produce liberation of human beings, but actually would produce probably more and more exploitation in the long run. Despite that generalized understanding in a variety of quarters, at least at the intellectual level, in the intellectual elite of society, capitalism has been anyway capable to triumph and to become basically the way of life, either real or aspired, of most of the people of the world. And this expansion was also itself predicted by many a long time ago, and actually is the way in which institutional settings tend to unfold, because capitalism tends to be incompatible with any alternative structure of relationship between individuals. Once a relationship is established in capitalist terms, that is to say, is a contractualized value of exchange relationship, it is incompatible with any kind of other models of relationship that can govern the same kind of condition. Let me give you an example. The moment in which you introduce money and pain for every kind of course of action, you immediately transfer and change the nature of that course of action. Pain, the fact of giving money in consideration of something, introduces a quid pro quo kind of nature of the relationship, which is the value of exchange, that takes the relationship away from quality and introduces a quantitative aspect that changes ontologically what the relationship is about. Okay? And this is, the examples would be very, very easy, and because this morning we started discussing Mr. Berlusconi's sexual behavior, that is very clearly and easy to see in the kind of relationship called sex. The moment in which you introduce money in the relationship changes. Okay, so it is something that it is something that intimately changes the nature of things, and that is called commodification. Okay, and the transformation of relationships from quality-based relationship into commodified exchanges has been the pattern of development of capitalist evolution since its inception, which I would locate roughly with modernity. Okay, so with the big enclosure movement in England in the 17th century, or even before that, with the discovery of the New World, so the so-called scientific revolution. Now, this pattern, the fact that we live under institutions that are produced by values of exchange, okay? And today, we observe the crisis on television. Anywhere in the world, what we talk about is, the values, if the stock exchange went up or went down, and the spread between the German Bund and the Italian or the Greek title of state. We kind of tend to look at reality in quantitative terms, and we kind of look at reality in terms that are already completely commodified. And therefore, when we've been talking about, the collapse of capitalism in 2008, we are basically saying, well, there was a moment, there was at the end of a cycle of expansion. It was a cycle of expansion that had its own turbulences. It's not that until 2008 everything went well. And we had ups and downs, but in 2008 apparently there has been some sort of a stronger kind of collapse whose reasons are not only into small financial issues, but on very foundational problems in the transformation, in the creation of the next phase of capitalism. Okay? So capitalism is now in a phase of transition, that is to say, the financial part and the financial expansion, which built on the idea of getting everybody indebted, that paid for a while, that certainly paid for a while, for about 20 years or so, is now over. And capitalism is striving to find something else to do. And this something else to do that is happening now is probably yet another phase of commodification of common resources. Okay? If you look at what happened in the plans that the IUC or the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank have given to the countries that are passing through the crisis, and in particular the prescriptions of the European Bank to Greece, to Spain, and to Italy, had included a massive expansion of the package of public sales, that is to say, of privatization of public assets and of liberalization of economic activities in sectors of public necessity. That is to say, basically, there are some fundamental things that society and people do together in society. We have to try to go for a new round of privatization, because this new round of privatization opens new possibilities of capital expansion in stuff that before we didn't think could become commodified. And I will give you an example that is very basic and simple. Most of you probably use social networks such as Facebook, and most of you know that this guy who invented Facebook is becoming enormously rich. And that this guy that invented Facebook is a pluribillionaire, and so you might wonder where his money coming from, right? And you might wonder whether, and we probably kind of assume that it's natural and normal that someone that has a good idea becomes obscenely rich. And we recognize that as a condition of nature, Some people are born and have a good idea and become obscenely rich, like Mr. Bill Gates, for example. Some other people, might have very good ideas and not become obscenely rich. Yet we consider there is some sort of natural selection of of good ideas that make you obscenely rich against good ideas that don't make you obscenely rich, And then there is some sort of natural selection, very mysterious, that makes, someone become rich and some other not become rich. Now, the point is that money that makes Mr. Gates or in the example I was calling Zuckerberg, I guess it's called or something like that, the guy who invented Facebook, very rich, is that a large number of people is working for him. And this large number of people that is working for him many times don't know that they are working for him. Because one of the fascination of capitalism is that we work for capitalism even when we don't know we're doing that. We go out there on Saturday and Sunday with our wife and our kids to do some shopping, and in fact we are working for capitalism. We go online and we use the Facebook, and in fact we are working for Mr. Zuckerberg, because he is actually the one who is writing the returns of the connections that we have and the exchange that we have with our friend, which is a typical, usually non-commodified relationship. I have a friend, or and I love him or her very much, and our relationship is not commodified, normally, okay? Now, with the Facebook, there has been the new step that has been the commodification of friendship relationship. Now, I have a friend, and my relationship with this friend is producing a surplus value for Mr. Zuckerberg, and that surplus value is my work for him that I'm not knowing that I'm doing, okay? So this is really the next phase of the, so to say, commodifying process and strategy that capitalism is developing, accompanied by a massive rhetoric, as it always happened, that is the massive rhetoric of freedom. If you think about it, you know, what is the most successful rhetoric for protection of private property in the world? Isn't that the idea of freedom? Isn't the idea that property equals freedom? Isn't that the fundamental Lockean notion? Freedom equals property, the fundamental values of the United States of America. Yet today, if you go around in the city, you will see that if you do not have property, you do not have any freedom. That is to say that property equals freedom in the sense that it's taking away all the freedom. There is a finite amount of freedom. There is a finite amount of everything in the world. There is a finite amount of rhetoric, that is probably even a finite amount of love. Okay? There is a finite amount of everything. This amount of everything can be actually shared or can be privatized. Okay? If it is privatized, it means that there is not anything else of that stuff for anyone else that doesn't have the title of privatization. Okay? So today, for example, if you go in the Grand Central in New York City, you will see a railroad station. Used to be a public space. Typically, the railroad station are places where people go and hang out and sit there and spend time, and homeless people probably even live there sometimes. Now it's entirely privatized. Very clean, perfect. It's not anymore, you know, there is nothing as bad as, you know, people hanging there and smoking cigarettes and joints and having dogs and the kind of stuff you see in public railroad. However, it's entirely privatized. That is to say that you can sit only if you can afford to buy a cappuccino that costs $3. Otherwise, you stand. There are no public benches anymore. If you sit somewhere that is not a public bench, some cop will arrive and will arrest you. They will be those that serve the interest, not of the public, but of the private property owners, mostly corporations, that do have the cafes and the bars in Grand Central, and that have privatized these public spaces, accompanied by a very nice rhetoric, which is the rhetoric of order and cleanness and all these kind of things, you know, making it a better place. So every transformation that is exploited, okay, every transformation that is exploited is accompanied by a massive rhetoric that is a dispositive of rhetoric, okay, that persuades those that are exploited that in fact exploitation is in their own interest. Okay? This is always something that if you study institutions, we have to study what actually happens and the rhetoric accompanying what happens. Okay? We can see property in action when a beach is privatized, when a public space is privatized. That means that you can access only if you pay. Okay? Your property is an institution of exclusion. You are the owner, you can exclude. Okay? Now you can tell the story of property from the perspective of those that have property. Okay? And then you can tell a story of freedom. And in fact, the founding fathers of the United States of America were all landed property owners. Life, liberty, and property is in the triads of the American Constitution and the grounds of the idea of the rule of law, exactly because it was drafted by someone who had property. So if you look at it from the perspective of those that have property, property equals freedom. I have property, I can do whatever I want. But if you see it from the perspective of those that don't have property, property is exactly the opposite of freedom. Property is exclusion. Property is taking away from you the possibility, for example, to see or to live, even to pee. You know, if you try to pee in the center of San Francisco and you cannot enter in a cafe, you are going to be arrested. Or alternatively, you know, the center of San Francisco stinks because people don't know where to be because all the places where to be are privatized. Okay? So there is a public dimension that is sacrificed by the construction of property. Okay? Yet property is an extremely successful idea. Property is a political category that still today is capable of incentivizing people to fight for it. And we had examples in the near past. The fall of the Berlin Wall, which I prefer to call, you know, the end of the Soviet Union, basically was accompanied by a huge resurgence of pro-property rhetoric. Right? Private property equals freedom was kind of the transfer from, it was written in a paper by an American law professor, from Marx to markets. Okay? So in going from Marx to markets, you need what? The great sacred institution of private property. Which was what during the Cold War, you're all too young to remember that, but I do remember that as well. During the Cold War, in the 70s and in the 80s, it was still very used in the rhetoric of political campaigning in this country to say, you know, if the communists win the election, they are going to put someone in your bedroom. So the fundamental idea, they do share apartments over there, okay? So I remember I was playing tennis actually in a very bourgeois circle in 1974. That was the time in which the Italian Communist Party went very, very close to become the first party in Italy. And there were elections going on. There was this huge paranoid tension about the fact that if the Communist Party would have overcome, you know, the Christian Democratic Party, then communism would happen in Italy. And everybody in the bourgeoisie thought that communism meant sharing apartment, sharing your place. Property equals privacy equals freedom. Communists win, they take away the property. You are stuck with someone that you don't know in your kitchen or in your bedroom. Okay, that's what it is. Okay? Now that very fundamental idea now makes us laugh a little bit. Because, you know, there were the kind of stuff that he would say. But on the other hand, if you think about it for a second, even today, any critique of property, such as the one that I just made, what I made, a critique of property, said, look, there is a public space, a private space, whatever you give to the private, you take away from the public. Therefore, if you say that property is freedom, you're saying that the public is not freedom. I mean, it's a zero-sum game. It's very difficult to say otherwise. Immediately people think, oh, why this guy is talking against property? What's wrong with him? Why is he touching the fundamental institution of an ordered civilization? Okay? So all the kind of intellectual ideas about property kick in right away. That means that it's a very successful rhetoric. On the other hand, now, if you do scholarship, and I hope that those that came here decided to spend this next year or so, a couple of years, in the business of understanding, okay? I really hope that you come here and you take, you know, you're in a time in your life in which you've been probably bombed by dominant rhetoric for the last 20, 25, 20 years of your life, 18 years, I don't know, you're probably 23, 24 or something. So you went through different processes of education, and most processes of education are ways to frame the mind of people, right? For me, I'm a law professor, I teach in law school, I always tell to the students, you know, one semester of law school, you stop thinking as a normal person. You start thinking as a lawyer. But it's not particularly different, you know, if you go in economics, if you go in sociology. You spend one semester there, they professionalize everything. You stop being someone that thinks freely, and you become someone that thinks within cages. And these cages of learning, okay, these cages of learning are usually, most of the time, the product and one of the genes by which the dominant rhetoric is produced. Okay? This is probably... Now, I'd like you to spend the next year or so in the business of trying to have a step back, looking at the kind of intellectual hammering that happened to you since, you know, age of 6 all the way to today, most probably. And think about it. And think about it, and start asking some fundamental questions. Let's stop, and you know, the philosophy of this place was really to stop a notion of knowledge that goes from general to more specialization to more specialization. The pattern, you know, the pattern of education everywhere, and this is non-critical education, is a vision of the unfolding of the intellectual life of people that goes from some general basic ideas all the way to further and further and further details, so that typically, you know, today, a specialized doctor is not specialized in eyes anymore, but is specialized in, you know, corneal diseases. And if you go to a general eye doctor, we'll send you to other 3 specialists in order to see what you have. Okay? And maybe you're stressed out. You know, maybe there are some holistic reasons by which your eye suffers. You know, maybe you've been crying a lot because you know your lover has left you or whatever. Right? But you know, you need a specialist. So knowledge is specialization. I question that for medicine a lot personally, but I tend to question it even more when it comes to so-called social sciences. Because when we get to the so-called social sciences, and I use the so-called because the moment in which you use the word science, you depoliticize something. Okay? The moment in which you say political science is politics that denies being politics. Okay? That it is, right? Political scientists are those that talk about politics, denying that they are doing politics. They're talking as scientists about politics, which is ridiculous. I mean, how can you imagine, you know, stuff like, you know, political institutions or legal institutions and approaches to those stuff that deny their political nature? You know, it's like studying birds denying they fly or something like that. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Okay? However, the scientific project is exactly that, right? You take away politics from learning, because politics is something that is not objective, cannot be measured, is subjective, is emotional, is not rational, cannot be measured. All these kind of things that we take completely for granted, as if they're natural, and that in fact are the outcome of a particular historical moment, which is the scientific revolution, in which human beings in the West, after having exploited resources from the so-called New World, had decided that there was such a thing called science that allowed you to study external objects as if you were not part of them. So it was basically a complete ideological move. Science means the capacity to talk objectively about something, and this talk objective makes that something an object. Okay? An object that is then separated from the subject, and the outcome of all of this is that humans don't belong to nature anymore. We consider ourselves as outside of the natural order because we can master it, we can own it, we have a domination position toward the external parts of the world. An ideological trick. Now, all these things penetrate in our world vision, and make very difficult for us to think freely. Positivism, for example. Positivism is the approach of modernity to everything. What makes something science, right? Economists, and I'm sure we have someone with some background in economics here, are very proud of saying, as economists, we can disagree very much in our political ideas. However, we all have a same toolkit that we use to analyze. What does that mean? That means that there is something out there called the world of the is, the positive world, what we can describe, okay? That we can describe objectively. And then we have something in here, separated from that is the world of the values, how things should be, the ought to be, okay? That is not scientific, it's political. So as a social scientist, you need to be able to separate what is the world of description, the positive world, from where the word positivism, okay? So the world of the facts, from the world of the values. That is the categories by which you interpreted the facts. Now the separation which is between facts and values is an epistemological trap. Is something that is not objective at all, is itself an assumption. Is itself an assumption. Our world, and this is particularly true when we study institutions, and when we study, political institutions, legal institutions, economic institutions, our world is very much the way we want to imagine it, okay? And it is a complete controlling process, this is to say a way to make people impotent, to tell them there is a reality that you cannot change. That's a strategy, a disempowering strategy. Okay? There is a reality, you need to be realistic. In order to be realistic, why do you need to be realistic? Because that is objective. Why is that objective? Because it's scientific. And therefore, please stop thinking about a new, better world. Just engage in what we have out here, because there is nothing you can do about it anyway. This is a rhetorical device. Is a way to naturalize the status quo. Is a way to make the status quo objective, scientific. However, it is still a strategy that is on the side of the winners. Because rhetoric is always on the side of the winners of social processes. You win a social process, you cancel communism in the Soviet Union, and you produce a massive rhetorical devices to explain to the people how better things are now, and how morally better it are, and how a morally superior society this is, and all of that kind of stuff. Okay? That is basically a way to serve those that want from those processes, and to marginalize the losers of the social processes themselves. Now in this place here, we try, and I really hope that you make your independent effort to do that, always to think from the perspective of the losers of the social processes. Okay? That is to say, whenever you see that there are some winners and some losers, if we want to do some good understanding, I'm not saying some good science because I don't believe in science as a notion, okay? But if you want to do some good understanding, please locate yourself on the feet of those that lost. So if Grand Central today is better or worse than yesterday, Grand Central is New York City station, you don't go and ask that to the people that are sipping their cappuccino, sitting there in the lounge, getting their nice little illy, okay? And you do not ask it to the corporation that is selling you the illy there. You please go out there and ask to the homeless people that have been kicked off there and now cannot sleep in Grand Central anymore. And ask them and see whether that transformative process was really something that produced more order, or whether it has produced just a little apparent island of order in a world of horrible disorder that is taking away people that were socializing in a way or another anyway out there, and now they are stuck in some other side of the city where, you know, sooner or later, stuff like those that happened in London 2 months ago will happen. Okay? So, understanding social processes requires locating the losers of those and try to see whether who are the left behind of these social processes. Once you have located the losers, and the losers are hidden. One typical thing, you know, is that the winners hide the losers. They deny their existence. When the West colonized Africa or colonized genocide Latin America, they simply denied the existence of real people there. They said these people don't know private property and therefore they're not civilized. These people engaged in eating each other, they're cannibals, completely invented crap, and therefore they're not human, we can kill them. Okay? So there is a denial going on of the losers of the processes, a dehumanization phase. Those Africans are lazy. We will not be able to produce, you know, if it was not for colonization, you know, they would not have reached whatever, you know? So there is a very clear pattern of denial of equality to losers of social processes. And losers of social processes, however, need to have a voice because the voice of the losers of the social processes, in this historical moment in which the world is actually collapsing, in which it's really coming out that we are all losers, okay? Which we are really touching the edges of the tipping point of no return. Global heating, you know, all of the kind of disasters we know. We're going to have a water war going on in the next years, millions of people who cannot drink, migration at levels of violence that are unprecedented. We're going to have tough years waiting for us. Okay? Now, if we want to handle these tough years with some good reasons, we better ask questions to those people we never asked questions before. Because those people we never asked questions before were those that had a much more sustainable style of life, had a much more holistic way to relate with nature, had some much more interesting institutional setting than our very simple idea of the state, a sovereign centralizing power, a boss with a territorial reach, or private property, which is a quasi-state in the hands of the individual. I'm the owner of my house, get out of here, you know, kind of idea. Okay? These institutional arrangements, that are the two great institutional arrangements of modernity, the state and private property, okay, are extremely unsophisticated notions. They produce patterns of growth and world visions that are very, very obsolete, that they are very, very primitive, and that actually require some major rethinking today. So the project here, and I hope you will share that in this few months of, you know, undisciplined learning, is to approach issues from the perspective of problems, locate the losers of the processes, try to understand why these people lost and how things could go better. Because, you know, if you ask, if everybody's happy about himself, it will not change. It's also personal, it's a natural personal thing. You know, if I'm particularly happy with myself, I don't criticize myself. After a while, I become arrogant. And after I become very arrogant, I also become very boring. You know, self-centered and egotistic kind of thing, okay? Now, institutions are the same thing. Institutions are human relationships. If they are so proud and happy of themselves for a long time, then they become very boring, very arrogant, and very violent, which is exactly what happened with the Western institutional settings of capitalism. Now, today, there is, and I agree with Saki on that, today there is a much broader understanding that global capitalism is not the solution. Actually can be the problem. Remember when Thatcher said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. That was 1980, 79. And at the time, and you guys were not even born, but at the time we all thought that whenever there was some problem, government should take responsibility to solve them. Okay? So there was a massive faith of the public sector. And then Thatcher arrived, Reagan arrived and said, you know guys, what? You goofed it. Government is not the solution. Government is itself the problem, okay? Good idea, they said. And all of a sudden, you start dismantling the government. And what is the solution, they said? What is the opposite of government? And what is the opposite of government? The market. Okay, the global market. So the global market was the solution. And we think in 30 years, 40 years, where the global market has brought us. In Greece today, there are people that are on the verge of hunger after having been bourgeois middle class in a Western European country. We're talking about a level of disaster, because you see, if you are used to things, this is one of the things that if you're used to something, you're much more resilient. People that are used to live in Palestine under certain horrible circumstances of oppression are clearly much more resilient and much more capable of adapting to those circumstances than people that lived under apparent freedom for many, many years and all of a sudden has to suffer that kind of violence. Okay? So if something happens suddenly, if you've been, living in relatively simplicity, relatively poverty for a long period of time, you are able to adapt. But if you were a middle bourgeois in a wealthy country, and you lose everything, and everything being the money, you lose the commodified part of yourself, then you fall in a well that has no way out. If you talk to the homeless people in the United States, and many of these people were people working, were people, that had a normal American dreamish kind of life, serving capitalism as buyers, okay? There's people that fell in the street. In a very short period of time, they get at a level of depression, of anxiety, of strain, that makes them becoming completely hopeless, okay? Now, this is something that we have to consider when we look at what is going on today in Greece. It is going to be a human tragedy of major proportions, and it's going to affect and make it even more visible at the center, the limits of the capitalist model. Because you see, when the limits happen in South America or in Africa, people don't care. People don't care, that's the reality. When troubles start to happen in the center, then people care. I remember, years ago I was in Somalia. In Somalia, the Italians, and I'm going to be done in 5 minutes. In Somalia, the Italians did one thing very interesting at some point. They were the colonial powers as well. Okay, they wanted to have the ships entering to Mogadishu port, and the port of Mogadishu was protected by a coral barrier. There were corals, okay? So the Italians said, well, we have to enter with the big ships, let's take away the coral barrier. So they took away a huge piece of coral barrier to get with the big ships in the port. And so the ships entered in the port because they needed to export the bananas that the Italians were producing in Somalia, trying to compete with Chiquita. So it was a completely kind of colonial idea, right? You go in a country, you disrupt the local kind of growth, you introduce banana production, then you bring bananas in the European market trying to compete with Chiquita, who is doing the same kind of stuff in South America. So so Europe now finally can have its revenge against United Fruit. So it's a world struggle of central corporations in the third world, okay? So they build the port, sharks start entering into the port. No sharks, Okay, big fish is very hungry. Okay, in the port there was also, very near the port, there was the butchery store. So the place where they would kill all the cows. Okay, so lots of blood in the water. Lots of sharks attracted by blood start arriving in Mogadishu. That was like a place where people used to go and to bath and to swim. And so they start, eating people. Literally, Bunch of kids get eaten, stuff like that. For 15 years, nothing happens. Once, a Belgian diplomat go to take a bath and finally is eaten himself. And I'm saying finally because when they were eaten, small kids, so many kids, nobody would care. The moment in which the shark had eaten the Belgian diplomat, then it became an issue. Okay? Then it became an issue. They started saying, oh, now we have to rebuild the coral barrier. And rebuilding the coral barrier is impossible. Okay? So they had to kind of invent all sorts of things like that. And they had at that point a big lesson, and this is one of the lessons that I hope you will bring here when studying the commons. The kind of services that the coral barrier was providing to the community on the coast, which was keeping the sharks away. Big service, very expensive to replace, not seen and not considered when the development project of the port was made, and therefore a huge hidden cost of the creation of the port, okay, that was actually produced by, a stupid big project that affected some common resources like the coral barrier, and then people would not realize it until the effect is seen at the center. So when they were eating African kids, nobody cares. They start eating a Western diplomat, then it becomes an issue. So you see, you need to see things. Now today, it seems to me that we are seeing the limits of global capitalism, and we are beginning to see it not just in the elite, but generally speaking, okay? This makes this a turning point. So now that we have, so it seems to me that now we are in a phase in which we need some reconstruction. We cannot be just happy in complaining and then saying that things are going bad. It's clear to everybody that they're going bad. They're going very, very bad. It's very, very difficult to find someone that says, no, it's going well for me. Well, maybe for Zuckerberg it's going well, but for most of the people it's not, okay? So now this is a good moment, it seems to me, to think about alternatives. And in order to think about alternatives, we need to think about what went wrong of the previous arrangement. So we had a time in which we thought that governments were the solution, okay? Then Thatcher arrived and said, no, governments are not the solution, are the problem. Then we have a time in which Fukuyama said, markets are the solution. And now we know that markets are not the solution either. So what should we do? Should we go back to government in a kind of pendulum so that then in another 20 years we will see that government won't work? Or should we start to think what is common between markets and government? And what are the fundamental commonalities of this system of governance that we should have to consider in creating some new institutional settings that serve for our future, okay? And it seems to me that the project of the commons that we will carry on here goes in, which is, this is a very tiny place where we're doing some little tiny work, which should not become like, thing that we are. But we are contributing in a worldwide effort to understand a third way, which is neither the government nor the global market, but is the rebuilding and the rethinking of some institutional settings that can move away from the mythologies of modernity that we don't believe in anymore. And those ideas are the ideas of the commons that are based on quality, they are based on sharing, they are based on inclusion rather than exclusion, they are based on a denial of the separation between the facts and the values, they are based in a strong somersault that will probably, hopefully, allows us to find something to fight for in the next few years. Okay, and then I'm gonna stop here and